So once again, welcome everyone to the Shippable Compliance webinar. Thank you again for joining us today. My name is Nina Liu. I'm the founder and CEO of Shippable. I'm really excited to be here today and to introduce you to my longtime friend and Shippable's custom brokerage partner, Greg Cumming. Greg
Thanks,
is
Nina.
Hi there, Greg. Greg is the president of Strix. He is a key customs brokerage partner for Shippable. Strix have been doing custom brokerage for businesses in the United States for more than 15 years. They have extensive experience in setting up compliance infrastructures, as well as doing customs brokerage consulting for businesses. His team has been a valuable asset for many in the United States. So I'm really delighted to have him here today and just have him share with you some best practices on compliance. Also with me here today from the Shippable team is Johnny, who is on the account side, as well as Felipe, who is on the customer support side. So before I actually turn it over to Greg, just a quick housekeeping item. If you have any questions during the webinar, please don't hesitate to type them in the chat window. We'll answer them towards the end of the sessions. So without further ado, I'll now pass it over to Greg.
All right. Well, thank you, Nina. I'm sure when everyone woke up this morning, they were thinking, gosh, let's talk about customs compliance today, because that is really on the forefront of all of our minds. But the fact is that, we're going to cover some things today that are really important issues for us as importers. And we're going to take a look at where things have been in the past and, more importantly, where they are now. So we're going to cover why should importers be concerned with compliance. We're going to cover strategies to avoid your compliance problems, and then how can SKU and part list visibility help you avoid compliance problems from a transmission point of view. So next slide, please. All right, first of all, why should importers be concerned about compliance? It's kind of a tongue-in-cheek item to word it that way, but the fact is that compliance should be the very first thing that you worry about when you're setting up and transmitting your customs entries and you're involved in your entire supply chain clearances into the United States. Where things have been in the past and where they are now are important to understand as we take a look at how we're going to be compliant importers. Before 2020, many of you on this webinar today have probably been importing for quite a while, so you remember those good old days, perhaps those pre-COVID days. But from a customs point of view, we were in a little bit of a different atmosphere back then. And the reason for that primarily is because customs systems themselves were different. There used to be a transmission protocol and clearance out there in the trade, which was called ACS. And this was essentially very old technology. Customs had systems that were really begun in the late 80s and then bolted on for many, many years. They were very much out of date. And so not only did you have transmission issues with dramatically rising volumes over the years, but you also had, from customs point of view, very little visibility into what importers were doing. So customs went to change those systems really 2017, 2018, and you may have heard the term the one window, and that was customs both upgrading their systems and also upgrading the transmission for both customs data and PGA data, that agency data that could be associated with some of the goods you might be bringing in. So before that all took place, we had an atmosphere which was somewhat complementary with customs. It was called informed compliance. What does that mean? Well, it meant that you were expected to educate yourself, and if customs had any questions or any issues with some of the goods you were bringing in, some of the information you had, you would get a CF-28, a request for information. If they didn't like completely what you gave them, then they gave you data, they gave you educational materials they expected you to read. They expected you to increase your understanding of customs procedures, right? We had enforcement. We wouldn't call it overbearing enforcement. Less enforcement seemed to be happening in the supply chain. And when enforcement did become part of your a particular file or a transmission, then customs would give you the educational materials, update you on regulations, show you where to go, and give you guidelines uh, on how to be a better importer, essentially. You also had a very interesting oversight issue, okay? And this is we have over 200 ports of entry in the United States. Every port of entry has an import specialist or specialists defined, by the size of that port. And it was at each port that oversight was occurring. So that import specialist would be reviewing tuna entries, steel entries, aluminum entries, every kind of industry that was out there, and a lot of them were making mistakes. They were making mistakes because the complexity of the products that were coming in, there was no way that any, import specialist could be able to be an expert in all of those things. So that was on the market to change. And of course, all of your transmissions were going through the old ACS platform, which meant we had a lot of outages and downtime at customs because it simply was not able to keep up with the volumes and the increases that were occurring in the trade. So, what's happened since then? Well, after 2020, we moved to what is best described as an enforced compliance strategy by customs. Okay. They had upgraded their systems. They now had the ACE platform, the automated commercial environment. And that platform offered the one window where you could transmit both the customs data and the agency data with one transmission. Your customs entry data went to the left, your agency data went to the right to the correct agency, and you would get customs clearance would come back. And then you would also get a may proceed by one of the agencies, if agency data was required, okay? So in this case, this also coincided with a change in the review process. And many of you probably have heard of the Centers for Excellence and Expertise. We call them the Cs. And Cs would now be set up on an industry basis where experts who understood that industry could review your entries, not just at the port level, but at a national level. So for you out there who are involved in a particular industry, if you're in a primary industry import, you should know who your C contact is. Because if you had a valuation or you had a classification issue, or you had, for some reason, customs was reviewing and not letting your goods go through, it's really good to have that contact because they're the ones who are looking at your entries now. It's not being done individually by the import specialist at the port. So that's been a really important change. Now, the other change, as we all know, is called big data mining. And customs now, with the new ACE platform, had a tremendous ability to mine your data. And so for the first time, customs is able to, let's say in its simplest form, take a look at the manufacturer and the MID that you're bringing goods in with, and then go look at any other importer who's also doing that. Take a look at the valuation of the products they're bringing in. Take a look at whether or not they're subject to ADD CVD, whether or not the scope is being covered by other people, but not by others. And in general, you're finding that there's a lot more review capability now than customs has ever seen. So, we like to think, what's the good and what's the bad? But when you think about this from a compliance point of view, you want to be compliant. You want to ensure that you've done a proper classification of your products. You want to make sure that you are evaluating them correctly per customs guidelines and that this will stand up to scrutiny if you get a CF-28, because the worst thing that can happen is you get a CF-28 request for information, you don't answer it properly, and all of a sudden you've got a CF-29 ruling that could very much go against you, cost you either duties or fees or even fines and penalties. So it's a different atmosphere out there. And, we get a lot of questions in the trade, I don't know what's going on. Why am I all of a sudden getting a lot more exams or a lot more scrutiny? What am I doing wrong in my program? And the answer to that is you may not be doing anything incorrectly in your program, but Customs has dramatically stepped up their oversight game. So there are just in general a lot more random exams that are going out there. So, you want to look at, you know, can we avoid random exams? The answer to that is no. What you want to try to avoid is specific examinations where they have targeted either a manufacturer or something that you're doing individually with your customs entry that's giving them reason to single you out. That's what we want to avoid. So, getting back to the big picture of compliance, it's a tougher atmosphere out there, and we want to do whatever we can to avoid that. Next slide, please. All right, so what are some of the strategies that we can do to avoid some of these compliance problems? Okay, so the first thing that we all kind of learn when we get in this business is, what does being a compliant importer mean? And the first thing that we're told is we're expected to take reasonable care. That wonderful, vague legal term that is both difficult, but also somewhat easy to comply with. Okay, so reasonable care at its core says document what you're doing. Okay, take a look at your particular supply chain and import practices and codify them, set up an SOP, work with the people on the import team to make sure, hey, do we have a solid classification process in place here? Who is doing that? What kind of training do they have? And do we have an expectation to classify our goods before we even order them or bring them into the United States? Because think about that. If finance orders product and it just because they get a great price out of China, and I don't want to single China out, but they've been, this is where a lot of issues have come up because we've got both 301 duties and we've got a lot of anti-dumping that comes out of products of China. So when your finance team or your sales team are looking at new products to bring on, the very first call they should make before they order that is you. Because in the import compliance department, you want to classify that good so you're able to let finance know just exactly what the duties and fees or possible subjectivity to data requirements by either agencies or if they could fall under a scope for anti-dumping. Nothing's worse than, hey, the product hits the shore and, hey, this is subject to anti-dumping. And all of a sudden, it's nowhere near the landed cost that we thought it was going to be. Valuation is also a very interesting thing that Customs looks at. And again, with big data mining capability, they can look at the price points that everybody else is bringing those goods under. So this is probably most prevalent when you're a related party. And if you are a subsidiary of a foreign company and you're bringing in goods kind of on a related party basis, Customs will look very closely at the valuation you're bringing in to see if it's fair market value out there. So make sure that the valuations that you are looking at for your goods do pass that kind of muster. Classification, we've talked a little bit about. Probably the biggest thing that Customs looks at is, are your goods classified correctly? In the past, look, we've seen it for many, many years. People try to class based on duty rates, okay? And I'm not saying that it was easy to do duty rate classification in the past, but it certainly wasn't as hard as it is now. So Customs wants the correct classification. And I've even seen it go the other direction. You'll get a CF28 and it'll say, well, this is the classification we think it is. And customers will come back and say, no, it's this. And it was actually a lower duty rate. Of course, that doesn't happen a lot, but customs wants the correct duty classification. So get back to the C. Do you have a relationship? Do you have a contact at the C? Can you bounce that classification off them and get a ruling? Looking up cross and looking up previous rulings, always the best place to start there. And if you run into a really complex product, do a little bit of work, because it's always great to understand classification internally. But at some point you might go, hey, look, I just don't get where to go from here. That's when you call a customs broker. And that's our job. We've gone through a lot of training and classification through a lot of different industries. So, certainly we can assist if that's necessary. What do we do with all the compliance programs that we're working on? We codify them, right? We want to show customs, if we were to get an audit or if we were to get a specific request for information, what we did to back up our classification or our valuation or the data that was involved in that entry. So, we say think paper trail, paper trail, paper trail, but that's what it's about. Customs wants to see, hey, did they take reasonable care when they were classifying this product? And if you can show that you did, then you are deemed to be taking reasonable care. And it's much less likely for you to ever get a fine or a penalty. At the end of the day, they're going to tell you what they believe is correct, and that may not always jive with what you have. But you want to make sure that this is a cultural thing within your company. We don't want different team members to have different views on compliance. We don't want to walk the gray line. We want to be fair to our company. We want to do the right thing, but we don't want to take side steps and shortcuts, because if we do that, customs could deem that to be negligence. That could result in a fine or a penalty. You don't want that. You don't want to be one of those importers that gets singled out by customs, because once you get a little demerit mark next to your importer, they will look at you more, and we have seen it. Sometimes you can't avoid extra scrutiny by customs if customs has targeted your manufacturer. And we see this from time to time where all of a sudden, like, why the heck are we getting so many exams? And look, none of us want exams. They delay our shipping, they delay our supply chain. And, if we can put great practices into place to avoid that, we want to do it. But if customs all of a sudden says, we don't like that manufacturer, and we're going to look at the goods that are coming in and we're going to examine them more frequently, sometimes you can't avoid it. So, at the end of the day, we do our best, but sometimes you don't know what customs is looking at. So, the last little item on here is, a little bit of what I spoke about earlier, the culture. Are we creating a compliant expectation? Are we a compliant environment for which we're setting up our supply chain and our interaction within the company? If you can set that stage and set that feeling among your culture, then that's what they're going to do. They're not going to say, ooh, this guy's cutting corners, or that we're trying to, scoot one past customs here. That's not the kind of culture you want, because I can tell you customs will find that out, and you don't want to be on the wrong side of, all of a sudden getting a due bill for $100,000. All right, next slide, please. All right, SKU level visibility. How can that help you avoid your compliance problem? SKU level, part number, however you want to define it, the very first best practice that you can have is to have a parts list. And, it's usually you have a parts list that begins in finance. That kind of, can be a problem once you get to the import side. But we could say, hey, part 101 is for this widget, but that widget might have 5 different manufacturers from 5 different countries. Fine for finance, not so fine for us in the import side of things. So sometimes if you can get finance to listen to you and have them set up their parts list or their SKUs based on the manufacturer, that can come in very, very handy when it comes time to bring those goods in for clearance. Because if, a lot of times HTS is required data, especially at the FDA level, which could be subject to, manufacturer specific data. So anything you can do to get finance to listen to you on that would be really great. But the basic part number begins with a part number and its classification. And if you are doing that today internally, that's really great. If you're not, you should start to become more educated in classification. That classification really is at the base of everything that's going to happen from there, because that HTS is going to say, what's the duty rate? Yeah, that HTS is going to, once combined with the country of origin, could it be subject to 301? Could it be subject to a trade possible as special program? It will trigger any data needs from agencies, and it will also trigger possible quota or possible subjectivity to ADD or CVD. Starting with the part number, starting with the classification, then lets you interact with your finance group again and let them know what is the final duty rate that you're going to be bringing those goods in under, and allows you to understand the landed cost. Because if you don't have that, or if you're off by 5% or 10%, or even worse on the ADD side, all of a sudden the margin expectation for that good goes away in a heartbeat. It might even end up being negative. So just so important to have that parts list. Really, one of the best practices that you can do is to have a solid parts list, classification, and then if you can extend it out to the country of origin and the manufacturer, then you can get even better details on what's going to happen when you go to bring that in. If you're able to work with a TMS partner, you're able then to use that parts list to automate both your compliance and your entry processes. So it just, begins to make things easier at all levels. And, again, having the part number and the classification means that you're in control of your import processes. You're not outsourcing that and not really understanding what might be correct or incorrect. So you want to take advantage of those of the special pricing programs that could be available from certain countries of origin. And if you set up a parts list and finance says, hey, I can get it at this price in this country, and you come back to them and say, okay, well, unfortunately, it is subject to 301 out of China, or it's subject to possible ADD, CVD out of this country, then finance can go, oh, okay, I didn't know that. I've got another source in another country. Tell me about that. Well, that country might be subject to special pricing programs. Might, if it's not China, so, wouldn't be subject to 301. So there's a quick 25%. And so it allows the entire organization to price the products at the lowest possible landed costs that they could. And understanding the landed cost, that's really where we begin and end, because how we bring in these goods, bringing them in correctly, means that we're going to maximize margins and profitability for our country. So again, compliance, let's start with that. Let's create that culture. Let's create systems, backup, paper trails, and everything that not only creates that compliant environment, but also backs it up with the reasonable care expectations that customs have. From here, I'll kick it over to Nina for the next slide.
Thank you, Greg, for guiding us through this informative presentation. I really appreciate you sharing these with the importers. They can certainly benefit from your expertise, as well as navigating the complex world of customs regulation through a visibility platform. So by combining Strix's expertise with a global trade visibility platform, importers can gain complete visibility into their customs data, making it easier for them to manage their landed costs, build a strong import compliance strategy that identifies strategic opportunities while also minimizing costs and risks. So with the shippable platform, importers can track every unit of their import goods earlier in the journey, right from the factory stage. So having, to Greg's suggestions, parts being identified with SKU that are actually separated with different countries will be easily managed through a platform like ours. It creates a centralized information point for every SKU, enabling your team to easily keep track of all the digital paper trail, collaborate and access shipping and entry documents. This also helps them in performing internal and external compliance audits, while also sharing information with duty drawback experts or compliance experts. Ultimately, through a visibility platform, your compliance team can have a centralized source of truth for the entire organization and be able to receive and collaborate on feedback from different departments. So thank you so much for allowing us to share this information with you. And right now, I'm going to open up the floor for questions and answers. So one of the questions I have for Greg is, Greg, from what I've heard previously, customs require us to keep document and paper trail for a certain amount of years. What is your suggestions or advice in terms of what documents to keep, as well as how to structure it?
Sure. So for those of you who are involved in ocean shipping, you've got an ISF requirement. And that, interestingly enough, ISF is a security filing. It's not a U.S. Customs filing, but everything transmits through U.S. Customs systems, since that was the obvious platform where, they were going to be able to do that. But it's a congressional mandate. And of course, when Congress set this up, they didn't really think about the paper trail or keeping records. So it fell on a statute of limitations, which is 6 years. So wherever you're having your ISFs filed, you'll want to keep those records for 6 years. Now, here's the interesting thing that happened in the trade. As you might imagine, the U.S. Customs bond that you have to secure duty and fee payments also secures your ISF compliance. So if you, for some reason, don't file your ISF on time, make a mistake, forget it, whatever happens, you get a fine from Customs for that. Your U.S. Customs bond covers that if you don't pay it. So what happened was the surety industry went crazy because they thought they were going to have a 6-year risk tail on all ISF's filings. So they got together with Customs and they met and established a 6-month review process for filing. Again, fraud will not be included in that. If there is some fraudulent aspect of the ISF, I don't know what that would be. But they did this to assuage the surety industry, because 6 years of risk means that they would have had to, it would be acting almost like an anti-dumping bond. So 6 months is generally when you would expect to get a fine or a penalty for your ISF filing if you didn't file it timely, which is really the fines that we're seeing today are non-timely filings. But nonetheless, you have to keep a record of your ISF transmission data for 6 years. Okay, so that's the ISF side. The other side is the entry side. This is a little bit more complex, but there are essentially 2 parts to it. The first part is your regular customs data, okay? What we would call a non-anti-dumping or countervailing, okay? In the entry world today, your entry will liquidate in 380 days, 385, something like that. Or I'm sorry, 315 days. And so from a surety standpoint, Sureties view that risk to be inside of a year. So you see customs bonds renewing on an annual basis because surety views that risk to be limited to a year for all the entries that fall under that. Okay. The data requirement for you for a standard customs entry is 5 years. Okay. So with your either internal data, ERP, and systems, you want to keep data locally, or you keep it with your service provider, but that's a 5 year. Now, if you do have anti-dumping or countervailing, it is increased to 7 years. Okay. Now, a lot of times, anti-dumping, countervailing don't liquidate after 7 years. They keep going, but the customs requirement for your data is 7 years. Now, here's what I want you to think about. And we saw this happen with one of our clients. They got an audit. Customs comes in, and what's the first thing they do? They ask for all your files. Okay, give me files. Now this audit happened in 2020. Customs asked for files in 2012. Okay, hopefully most of you just had a little bell go off at the back of your head. You said, well, isn't that beyond the requirement for keeping your data? And the answer is yes, it is. But that's not going to keep customs from asking for it. Unfortunately, this importer gave them that data, and there was incorrect classifications at a different duty rate, and they had $15,000 in due bill for duties and taxes from that period. Okay, what they could have done, what I would tell you you should do, is be compliant to 5 years, and after 5 years, destroy that data, because your requirement ends at 5 years. Don't extend. I mean, obviously, if you get an audit and say, I don't have that, only comply with 5 years. But these are some of the things that can happen out there if you don't fully understand your requirements, customs. So there's a big long answer, Nina. So sorry about that, but that was, those are important things.
Thank you, Greg. That was very helpful. And having a system in place to keep track of your records and ensure that you have the right paper trails for the necessary terms is important. One other last question I have here is on product catalog. How often should we be reviewing our product catalogs and HTS codes?
I think you make your product catalog a living document. You create it. If you can have a discussion with finance about making your SKUs manufacturer and country of origin specific, that would be great. But once you set it up and you classify those goods, then make it a living document. Anytime you have additional, you do those specifically, decreases your workload, and then you just keep adding it to the SKU list. Now, as far as kind of relooking at your classifications, customs changes, HTS, they just had a really big change last year. They usually have big changes every 5 years. But you'll see changes sometimes every 6 months. And it's usually not very many HTSs that are affected, but you could find yourself having classified a good and having that HTS expire. That's something that I think you can act on in the moment, because when we would go to make entry, the HTS would be invalid, and so you'd have to kind of reclassify it at that point. If you have complex parties, or if you have questions on whether or not something is classified correctly, you should review it and review it on a regular basis if that makes sense to you. But it kind of depends on how many SKUs you have. Obviously, if you got 10,000 SKUs, doing that on a regular basis could be tough. If you've only got a couple of hundred, you could set up a program to look at it quarterly or something like that and go through them just to make sure, and then be fine. But to do it once right the first time and then make it a living document, I think that's a pretty good best practice out there.
Oops. Thank you so much, Greg, for answering that. And I see that we've answered all the questions. And thank you everyone for joining today. I think we'll be ending a little early, but giving us time back. So appreciate everyone for joining. We will share this recording with all. And thank you, Greg, for coming on and sharing this informative webinar with us. Have a great day.
Thank you.